Welcome to the Western Ohio PBIS Network podcast. My name is Brandy Stiegel. You are watching video 3 of a 7-part video series that is going to focus on helping your team to plan and establish those Tier 2 targeted interventions and supports. This video will focus on student identification. After this video, you will understand or be able to describe 3 ways to identify students for Tier 2 interventions. You will be able to develop a process that includes a minimum of 2 data sources to accurately identify students with those internalizing and or externalizing social, emotional, or behavioral risk factors. During the last module, we discussed the research behind PBIS as well as the process for selecting a team, a Tier 2 team, and the roles and responsibilities of that Tier 2 team. Once the Tier 2 team has been established, the next step is to begin the process of identifying those students who may be in need of Tier 2 supports and interventions. Multiple strategies should be used to identify students for Tier 2 supports. Examples of identification tools include office discipline referral, universal screening, instrument scores, teacher nominations, parent and support service recommendations, as well as those formative assessments that we may use. It is not necessary to use all possible identification methods. However, PBIS teams should remember that there is no one single method that is likely to be able to identify all students who may be in need of Tier 2 supports. Tier 2 teams should select and use multiple data sources to identify those students who may be in need of Tier 2 supports. Ideally, teams want to design a data gathering process so that all students have an equal chance to be considered for risk at least annually and preferably more times throughout that school year. The identification process or method that the team selects should be efficient in terms of cost, in terms of the amount of time required to collect data and to make decisions. It should not be an burdensome process. So, effective identification systems should be designed to identify students who present many classroom challenges. Those are those students who are chronically disruptive in the classroom. It should also be designed to identify students who experience in class consequences that may or may not ever receive an office discipline referral. So, those are those students that are having problems within the classroom, but those behaviors will fall under those staff managed behaviors. And so, those behaviors may not be documented within our office discipline referral data count. So we want to make sure that we have a way to identify students whose behaviors may not be severe enough to require an office discipline referral, but they are chronic enough to cause disruption to the classroom and trigger that they may need some Tier 2 supports. That identification system should be used to identify students who are identified with disabilities but still may need additional social, emotional, or behavior supports, as well as that system should be able to identify students who may be recommended by faculty, parents, or support professionals who may have observed some type of internalizing behavior that may have gone under the radar. So an effective identification process should generate information for students experiencing externalizing and or internalizing behaviors. So externalizing behaviors are behavior problems that are observable, they are overt, they're often directed toward people and or objects or in those social environment. So some examples of externalizing behaviors include talking out, non-compliance, those students that are constantly getting out of their seats without permission, those students that are constantly disrupting others, those students who are constantly talking back to the teacher with rude comments to the teacher and or their peers, those students who may be destructive towards property, those students that may be involved in theft, and in those serious violation of those school-wide rules. Internalizing behaviors on the flip side are those behaviors that the students direct inwardly towards themselves, himself or herself. These internalizing behaviors are often based on social deficits and avoidance. So some examples of internalizing behaviors include exhibiting shy behavior, being timid, being non-assertive, avoiding or withdrawing from social situations. This could also manifest itself as those students that do not talk or interact with their peers, those students who do not want to participate in games or activities or things that with their peers. So a tier two team is going to want to have data processes and student identification processes that are able to identify those students exhibiting those externalizing behaviors that may or may not cause disruption in the classroom, as well as those internalizing behaviors that may fall under the radar. So the tier two identification system should include protocols for identifying new or transfer students that are coming into that school building and that may be entering the school year at not beginning, they may be coming into the school at a different time. They may be transitioning from a new school, new enrollees, or whatnot. So the PBIS team should have a procedure in place for those students with multiple discipline referrals who transfer into the school. So anytime a new child is coming into your school building, you should have a process for collecting data to understand what services or supports they were receiving at their prior school. A team member or administrator should review any new student's record to determine if there are any existing behavior concerns and if there were any interventions at that former school. So we want to get into that cume and understand that student's history and if they were receiving those tier two supports at a prior school or any type of intervention supports. There should be procedures in place to teach all new students the rules, the expectations, the procedures, and routines of the school-wide and classroom system. So a part of our Tier 1 program is to make sure that we have a process in place to teach any new students that are coming into our building throughout the school year those lessons that are going to help them understand how to be successful. After new students have had the opportunity to benefit from your school's Tier 1 universal supports, students who continue to struggle can be brought to the team's attention by data decision rules, nomination, and or universal screening. So we always want to give those students a chance to be explicitly taught and receive those Tier 1 universal supports, those new students coming in. If we find that those are not sufficient, then we want to begin our using those data decision rules and our student identification process to determine if those students need those tier two supports. So most students, when we're talking about a tier two support system or a tier two framework, most students start a new school year without tier two behavioral support. We do this because this gives those students time to adapt to a new teacher, to adapt to those new classroom environments, to understand that new teacher's procedures and rules, and give that student a chance to be explicitly taught that new teacher's behaviors, procedures, and rules, etc. It's also important that we give the students that time to respond to those tier one universal supports. It is important for the teachers of those students to know that a student has previously participated in an intervention so that upon that new school year, they can provide that positive attention to that child to get the year off to a good start and implement those evidence-based effective classroom practices. So essentially, at the beginning of each school year, we are resetting. We have already identified that the student is now going into a new environment where there will be new rules, there will be new procedures, there will be a new teacher, there will be new classroom rules that this child needs to adjust to. So we want to give them an opportunity to support that. And we also want to make sure that we inform that teacher that that child has been a part of a tier two intervention support plan, and make sure that that teacher has the training to understand how to support that student and collect the data to ensure that they may need to continue with those services. An effective identification system will include a process that's going to allow teachers or parents and or students themselves to submit candidates' names to be considered for those tier two supports. So the first thing is that nominations should be designed for a quick response, supports for classroom teachers, and or rapid access to intervention for students. So teachers should be able to use this process efficiently. It should not be a very burdensome process. These nominations should be short and simple. It should require less than 10 minutes to complete because, again, we know our teachers are so busy. We don't want to do anything that overwhelms them further. So we want our nomination process to be simple and easy to complete. Typically, a teacher makes the nominations, but we also want to make that process be available for parents who may want to identify their student, their child, for tier two intervention support, something that they may be observing in the home. And also, we want to give a process for students who themselves may feel they need more support. Also, staff should be trained to consider and nominate those students with internalizing and or externalizing characteristics. So it's going to be very important that we educate and train that staff and those student personnel around the science of behavior so they are able to identify those behaviors. And then lastly, staff, students, and or a parent should be able to make a nomination at any time they feel that there is a concern or that they're concerned about students. So a student should be able to enter into this tier two frame intervention at any point of the school year. And so that process should be available so that we are collecting data multiple times per year, not as well as we are allowing nominations to happen at any point throughout that school year. So when we talk about what data do we want to use to help make those decisions? So teams can use existing school data to develop those decision rules that are going to create that entry point for access to the tier two team and those tier two interventions. That tier two team, when they're planning, they can set criteria that will be used to automatically trigger and initiate discussions about a student who may be at risk or who may be in need of those tier two interventions. After reviewing student data, the tier two team can then determine if an intervention is warranted or needed. To establish those decision rules using school data, those tier two teams must first consider and document student data that is already routinely collected. So example of data that we're continuously collecting in school could be office discipline referrals, those records of those classroom minor behavioral discipline logs. We can look at the attendance, we can look at student tardy rates, we can look at how students are performing in their classroom, their grades, their testing, and things of that nature. We can use any of that to collect data to help us identify students that may be at risk. A school team may decide that once any student has received a certain number of office discipline referrals, this is automatically going to trigger that team to schedule a review of that student's academic and discipline data and any other relevant data that's going to be helpful to identify if that student needs tier two interventions and supports. Ideally, that data trigger process that team is going to establish will identify students who are going to require more intensive assistance before those patterns have become chronic or before those problems intensify. So that process wants to be able to be proactive in identifying those students. The goal is to establish those data triggers that support early identification of those students who may be at risk for experiencing those social, emotional, and or those behavioral challenges. So when we think about what are some examples of existing school data that we are already collecting and that can be used to identify students who are at risk and may need tier two interventions. So some of that data includes those office discipline referrals. So we're looking at the number of referrals, when they're getting those referrals. We can look at classroom minors, those logs that our teachers, that our tier one team has, that data process that our tier one team has put in place to help track what's happening and those behaviors that are happening in the classroom. Our in-school suspension data, those students that are being sent to that in-school suspension, our out-of-school suspension, those students that are receiving office discipline referrals, and that consequence of that office discipline referral is an out-of-school suspension. We can look at their course grades, how well they're performing in their classrooms. And then we can look at any of that achievement data to do that. The goal is to use multiple pieces of data to help tell the story. So now let's talk about universal screening tools. So a third method for systematically identifying students who may require additional support is the use of a brief universal screener. Typically, universal screening instruments require a response to a short statement about emotional or behavioral characteristics of a student. These universal screener instruments and tools can be used to generate risk scores for all of the students in a grade level, in a particular school building, or within a district. Use of the universal screening instrument at tier 2 is designed for the identification for students only. It is not to be used for diagnostic purposes or for progress monitoring. So it is just used to identify at-risk students. It's not to be used to identify or to diagnose any type of mental health or behavioral problems. So there are a number of potential benefits for developing a systematic identification process that is going to incorporate the use of these universal screening tools. One benefit is that these tools are a fast, efficient, and respectful process that allows the capacity to include all children and youth of interest. So it's allowing us to screen all of the students within that building or that district to identify students who may be at risk and who may slip through the cracks through any other identification process that we have in place. When using a universal screening tool, if an error occurs, most often it is on the side of caution with the tendency that we've over identified a student rather than missing or letting students fall through the cracks. So the benefit is that the gift and the curse of this tool is that the downside is we may over identify students, but the positive and the pro of this is that we will not miss any students that may need support in tier 2 interventions. These tools are going to inform schools about the needs of their particular student population, which is going to assist with planning and resource mapping by finding groups of students that have common needs. So we have a valid and universal tool that we're using to identify the mental and behavioral health needs of the students. Universal screening is an evidence practice that is recommended by a number of different influential groups that are associated with educational policy and practice. And so when we talk about putting in evidence-based practices, using universal screening tools is a practice that is going to allow teams to identify those students that may be at risk. So the next thing to consider, we won't go over in this video the various assessments. There are a number of evidence-based universal screening tools that can be used. I advise teams to do their research when they're selecting a tool to consider how easily it is to be administered, what type of training. So there are a lot of things to look into. So for the purpose of this video, we're not going to go over any particular tools. We'll just go over general considerations and topics about those tools. So when there are a number of potential advantages for developing a systematic identification process that incorporates and uses these universal tools. So for example, and then there are some concerns and things that may that schools and districts may concerns that these districts or these school buildings may have. So one is the behavior is viewed as behavior is viewed as purposeful rather as associated with environmental arrangements. So number two, there is a widespread impression that kids will grow out of behavior regarding those behavior problems that they're displaying during those early years of child development. Where again, we know that is false. We know that students need behavioral interventions. Another concern is there are concerns about profiling or stigmatizing children and youth who meet risk criteria. So we're worried about that those students may be stigmatized as a result of being identified at risk. And then lastly, there's a fear of the cost and potential for identifying large number of students with emotional or behavioral disorders. So what happens when our screener tells us that we have more students that need these tier two supports than we can actually support? So there are a number of concerns that need to be addressed and identified prior to using these universal screeners. So let's go ahead and discuss some requirements for universal screening. First, we're going to talk about assessments and having an assessment plan and creating some general principles. So when students are observed, interviewed, or tested, the school staff must consider whether there is a need for that parent to be informed or if consent is required in order to conduct that assessment. IDEA permits screening procedures such as determining academic skills, phonemic awareness, proficiency, and other progress monitoring activities that is necessary to inform instructional programming without the consent of parents. Many schools are beginning to use academic and behavioral multi-tiered systems of supports. So in this case, assessment plans are not necessary for all of those MTSS activities. So when screening students, several general principles are going to apply. And so we're going to go over those activities. So one, keep in mind if educators are collecting new data for the purpose of determining disability, an assessment plan is always going to be necessary. If educators are reviewing existing data, such as how the student is responding to behavior supports or academic instruction for the purpose of assisting the teacher and instruction components or instructional methods, no action plan is required. So you want to look carefully into your state or your district's assessment plan requirements. So it's important to consider when parental consent is or is not required. And so even we always want to, in our communication protocols, keep parents involved in this process. We want to keep them in the loop, the communication loop. We know those are effective practices. We know that our tier one team, our tier two team, all of our tiered teams should have protocols in place to ensure that parents are informed and are being communicated with throughout this entire process of determining if their child needs tier two supports or more targeted supports. So parent consent is not required before administering a test or other evaluation to all children. When we're just having discussions about this child, we don't have to have any type of parental consent. Parental consent is not needed when we're just reviewing that existing school data that that child has. And parental consent, of course, is not required when we're screening for instructional purposes, when we're administering benchmark assessments, standardized tests that are going to be used to help make instructional decisions. So the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendments gives guardians certain rights regarding school administration of surveys. These rights include the right to consent if students are required to submit to surveys that concern mental or psychological problems of that student or that student's family. So the guardians have, or the parents have the right to inspect when they request and before administration or use of that survey that is going to be collected, any protected information of the students, just like they have the right to instruct, to look at any instructional material that will be used as a part of the curriculum. So if universal screening surveys are being completed by students, a school should seek a guardian consent and student consent. If universal screening surveys are being completed by teachers about students, a school should seek to inform their guardian. So again, we want to ensure that we are keeping parents a part of this process and help them understand why these surveys may be administered and why we may be needing to collect this data and how this data will be beneficial and help to inform some of our policies. So to think about this, so next we're going to talk about some universal screening considerations, some things that we need to consider. So the first thing is we need to make sure that the person who can authorize social, emotional, and behavioral screening has been identified and the approval is obtained to design and implement the process. So when a building team or a district team is designing this process, we want to make sure that we have somebody that has decision-making power to authorize this collection of this data and this administration of this survey. This has gone through the proper channels. We want to also make sure that a clear purpose and intended outcome of screening is documented and aligns with the district and building level mission, priorities, and improvement goals. So we want to make sure if we decide to do this survey, that we have a clear purpose of what we want to learn from this data and that we stick to that purpose and that we're very transparent about that purpose. The team wants to ensure that the policies and procedures for screening in non-behavior area is used to inform the development of a system for social and emotional behavioral concerns. So we are using this to inform our decisions. We're not using this as a diagnostic assessment. We're not using this as a progress monitoring. We're using this as a purpose to inform and understand the needs of our population. Another thing to consider is that the policies and procedures for social and emotional behavioral screening include decision rules for parent notification, parent consent, and the use of the results. So we want to make sure that we are informing our parents prior to administering any of these surveys, that we're getting consent for their students to collect this data about their children, and that we help them understand how these results will be used and what the intended impact is. The policy and procedures for social and emotional behavior comply with district child fine procedures. So we are following whatever those district the district child fine procedures are. We're ensuring that we're in alignment with those procedures that we have in place on how to collect data, how we collect data for students, and how that data can be used. There is a point of contact at the district and building level who will take responsibility for oversight of the screening process. That person has been identified. So we want to make sure that we've planned out this process. We have a person that is responsible for overseeing the administration to ensure that the tools are used correctly and that the data that we collect will be accurate and valid. So a couple of things to think about. So some other universal screening considerations is that universal screening systems should have clearly defined procedures. So number one, there should be a timeline for administration that has been determined and is frequent enough to catch transient students. So we should try to administer these universal screeners multiple times a year, maybe at the beginning of the year, midway through, or towards the end of the year. And we have a process in place to collect data for students that may be transferring into our school throughout the year. The screening process should include provisions that all students are considered and the process is suitable to identify those students with internalizing or externalizing concerns. And again, as we said earlier, those internalizing behaviors are sometimes those behaviors that can fly under the radar. So we want to make sure that whichever tool we use is going to be able to identify students with both internalizing and externalizing behaviors. A third consideration is that we want to have an evidence-based instrument with appropriate psychometric properties and norms that have been identified. So there are, like I said earlier, there are a number of tools that you can research. I would encourage research teams, reach out to those publishers to have demonstrations or to see samples of those assessments. What tool you decide to use is going to be based on your building and your building needs. As again, there are a lot of different tools out there that you can use to administer, but we want to make sure that it's an evidence-based instrument. Lastly, an instrument should have clear instructions on how to complete that and administer that instrument with training for all on how to complete. It's very important that whatever tool you all select, that you have had some training, that everybody that is going to need to administer that tool has been trained on how to do so. So another consideration is that universal screening system should have, again, following up those clearly defined procedures. So the resources should be available to support universal screening, meaning you should have enough personnel, the materials, and the time to provide those teachers and those persons that are going to be responsible for completing those screeners. They should have the time to be trained in that professional learning to understand how to administer those screeners. A team should exist that can support the student, family, and classroom in determining what response should be taken for students who are identified at risk. So once we have put this tool in place, there should be a process in place for what happens next for those students that we've identified, that screener has identified for being at risk. So what we don't want to do is use this screener, identify students that are at risk, and then we have no interventions, no tier 2 interventions that are in place to support those students. School and community-based supports for responding to identified students are available and adequate to serve the level of need. So again, prior to that tier 2 team creating and not creating, but actually administering this universal screener, they should have a plan in place for how they're going to support those students that they're identifying. And so that tier 2 support system and those interventions should be in place prior to that student identification process. Because again, the goal of these tier 2 interventions is to be immediately accessible once we identify that a child is in need of those supports. So ideally, when a team is getting ready to administer these universal screeners, they should already have their tier 2 framework planned out, and those students should be ready to receive those interventions as soon as they have been identified. So thank you for tuning into this video. Please don't forget to hit like or subscribe.